Long ago, there was a place called the Kingdom of Midnight, where the land was lush because water was plenty, but there was no oil to light the lamps. When the sun set, darkness swept through the kingdom. The Kingdom of Midnight was ruled by a grand prince, and he hated the dark. He stumbled around the large palace rooms, bumping into the royal throne until he was royally black and blue. He could not find his royal pajamas.
I cannot be a proper prince without my royal pajamas.
He whined. No one dared to say no to the Grand Prince, especially when he yelled or whined, and no one dared to be his friend. When the shadows fell like sleepy eyelids on every home, people held on to each other, but no one hugged the prince. Night after night, alone in his palace, he prayed to God for an answer to his problems. One morning, a roving messenger told the Grand Prince of a place where oil flowed freely and light brightened the darkest night.
At the edge of your land, just beyond the trees, lies the kingdom of the desert.
Described the messenger.
It's ruled by a grand princess.
Perhaps this was the answer to the prince's prayers. He mounted his royal crane and rode to the palace where a valley divided his kingdom from the kingdom of the desert. There, from a distance, he saw light and the princess. The kingdom of the desert was a land that sparkled with light, but there was no water to grow gardens. The grand princess bemoaned the lack of water. Her blue royal robes were always dull from dirt and dust. Without water, there was no hot royal tea.
I cannot be a proper princess without royalty,
She shouted. No one dared say no to the grand princess, especially when she shouted, and no one dared to be her friend. When storms blew sand throughout the kingdom, the people held on to each other, but no one hugged the princess. Night after night, she prayed to God for an answer to her problem. One morning, a roving messenger told the grand princess of a place where the water flowed freely and the gardens grew in abundance.
Go to the edge of your land, and there, just beyond the sand dunes, is the kingdom of midnight.
Promised the messenger.
It's ruled by a grand prince.
Perhaps this was the answer to the princess's prayers. She rode her royal ostrich to the place where a valley divided her kingdom from the kingdom of midnight. There, from a distance, she saw water and the prince. When the grand prince returned to his kingdom, he ordered the keeper of the royal crane, inform
the princess that if she desires water, she must come to me with jugs of oil.
But when the grand princess heard of the prince's demand, she refused. When the grand princess returned to her kingdom, she ordered the keeper of the royal ostrich,
inform the prince that if he desires oil, he must come to me bearing buckets of water.
But when the grand prince heard the princess's demand, he too refused. God was sad that the grand prince and princess did not see the answer to their prayers. Many nights passed, but despite the darkness and the desert, the prince and princess would not budge. Then, one morning, the boy who was the keeper of the royal crane led it to the prince's window. The girl who was the keeper of the royal ostrich led it to the palace door of the princess. The prince and princess thought it strange that the children should bring the crane and ostrich from the royal stables without being told to do so. The royal crane whooped.
Perhaps I should speak to the princess,
mused the grand prince. The royal ostrich screeched.
Perhaps I should go speak to the prince,
mused the grand princess. And so the prince and princess rode to the place where the valley divided their kingdoms. This time the prince came close enough to hear the princess praying for water.
Her voice sounds like the desert wind,
he said wistfully. For a moment he thought he might go to meet her, but then he yelled,
I am the grand prince. She must come to me.
His heart grew cold and hard. The princess heard the prince offer a prayer for light.
His voice sounds like summer rain.
she said sadly. For a moment she thought she might go to meet him, but then she shouted.
I am the Grand Princess. He must come to me.
Her heart grew cold and hard. The day wore on, but in his stubbornness the prince would not move. When darkness swept through his kingdom, the legs of the prince became as hard as rock and as cold as stone. The day wore on, but in her stubbornness the princess would not move. When a storm blew sand through her kingdom, the legs of the princess became as cold as stone and as hard as rock. God was sad that the grand prince and grand princess had refused to see the answer to their prayers. The people of the Midnight Kingdom and Desert Kingdom awaited their prince and princess. When they saw the royal crane and the royal ostrich return without their riders, they knew something was wrong. But the people were afraid to venture out to the edges of their kingdoms, to a place they had never been. But the young boy who was the keeper of the royal crane decided to follow it wherever it would lead him. The young girl who was the keeper of the royal ostrich decided to follow it wherever it would lead her. At the very place where the valley divided the kingdoms, the royal crane whooped and the royal ostrich screeched. They would go no further. The young boy and girl stopped and saw each other. They seemed to hear voices like summer rain and desert wind, but when they looked down, they only found 2 pairs of royal shoes lying on the ground. And when they looked up, they saw 2 mountains with peaks shaped like royal crowns. The mountains looked familiar. When the boy of the Midnight Kingdom saw how the girl's lips were cracked and how her skin was dry as twigs, he gave her the jug of water he had taken for his journey. When the girl heard of the terrible darkness that made the boy tremble at night, she gave him a jug of oil she had carried for her journey. The boy and girl returned to their kingdoms to tell the people what they had found. At first, the people of the kingdoms did not believe the children. They are just imagining, they all agreed. Princes and princesses do not turn into mountains. But when the people saw the boy's jug of oil and the girl's jug of water, even though they didn't believe the story, they followed the children anyway. When the people finally arrived at the edges of their kingdoms, they saw the mountains with peaks like royal crowns. There was no doubt that these were the Grand Prince and the Grand Princess. The boy who was the keeper of the royal crane and the girl who was the keeper of the royal ostrich brought each other jugs of oil and water. Before long, all the people were doing the same. There was enough water and enough oil for everyone. The people called the place where they gathered between the 2 mountains the Valley of Seeing, because at long last they saw God's answer to their prayers. Each year, the people of the 2 kingdoms bring their children to the Valley of Seeing to tell the story of the mountains. Voices like summer rain and desert wind still whisper prayers in the valley, and God smiles and says, Amen. In our community, many times people are stubborn, disagree, and don't get along simply because of their differences. In the story, we realize that we are stronger together rather than apart. The people in the kingdom of midnight and in the kingdom of the desert both need each other's help, but the prince and princess are too stubborn and selfish to approach one another and become friends. Because of their inability to ask for help, they turn into mountains of stone and are forever stuck in place. If they had only just reached out to one another in their times of need, they and everyone else in their kingdoms would have benefited. We learn that we should ask for help and be kind and friendly with people like the 2 children, rather than selfish like the prince and princess.